Welcome to another episode of Scottish Murders. When I said in a previous episode that this episode might be slightly delayed, I meant only a couple of days. I didn't mean 3 weeks, but best laid plans and all that. Firstly, my gran's been in and out of hospital over the last few months, and again a couple of weeks ago. So I've just been spending a lot of time at the hospital as she was in an open ward, and then again at our house when she was eventually released. Plus, I also forgot that I was cat-sitting for my sister. And if you're watching on YouTube, I'm putting up a couple of photos. And she's just so cute and adorable. I couldn't get much done while I was looking after her. So with these things going on, and the fact that it doesn't take me much to get distracted, Scottish Murders just got put on the back burner for a little bit. But finally, here is the long-awaited episode, part 3 of 4 parts. Part 1 was all about the disappearance of Pat McAdam in 1967. Part 2 continued by taking us up to 1975 and told of just how Pat's case remained in the public eye for decades at the hands of a dedicated and ethical journalist, despite the means, which, in my opinion, were ever so slightly sceptical. Part 4, the final part, will take Pat's case right up to date, including a male being charged with Pat's murder 37 years after her disappearance. And in this episode, as promised, I'm going to be telling you all about Pat's potential murderer, Thomas Ross Young. So, you've waited long enough. Let's get started. Thomas Ross Young was born illegitimately in Glasgow in 1934 and was immediately rejected by his unmarried mother, something that he apparently carried a grudge about throughout his life, with his future ex-wife Annie saying that he had absolutely no respect for women, that they were just there to be used and abused by him, having always felt he'd been rejected by a woman, his mother, when he was young. Thomas was, however, taken in by his mother's parents and lived with them in Kirkintilloch in Glasgow, and they officially adopted him when he was 12. By this time, Thomas had already begun a life of crime when, at only 9 years old, he was convicted of a theft in April 1943, followed in November 1943 by 3 counts of theft by housebreaking, and in 1945, when he was 11 years old, he appeared in court yet again for a similar charge, and this time he was admonished. In 1948, 2 years after he was adopted, he received his first sentence, again for theft, but also, significantly, for indecent assault. This time he was sent to an approved school, which is a residential institute for young offenders. It would appear this short spell of punishment deterred Thomas from crime, as for 13 years he didn't have any run-ins with the police, only getting in trouble in 1953 when he was 19 years old while serving in the army, when he was court-martialed for being absent without leave, receiving 91 days detention. In 1955, when Thomas was about 21, he left the army and moved back to his hometown of Kirkintilloch. He began working at an iron foundry and met Annie. Annie immediately fell for Thomas's charm and good looks. Thomas stood at 5 foot 8 inches tall, or about 1.76 metres, weighed about 14 stone or 89 kilograms, used chest expanders daily to keep fit, as well as practicing karate, and he had short brown hair and frightening, staring, hazel-coloured eyes. He also had tattoos of naked women on his arms. One had a snake curling around her, and the other was sitting on a champagne glass with a few musical notes alongside. Apparently, Thomas used to say that this was a perfect representation of what he loved: wine, women, and song. Thomas and Annie eloped, getting married the following year in 1956 in Chesterfield in England, against the wishes of Annie's mother, who said that there was something she just didn't like about Thomas, but she never said what that was. Thomas and Annie stayed in England for a short time, and Annie said that these were happy days, and that Tommy got a job as a long-distance lorry driver and used to take me on trips with him, going on to say that, at this stage, he would have given me the moon. However, she ended by saying that after moving back to Kirkintilloch within 2 years of getting married, where Thomas initially got a job working on the buses, it wasn't long before their marriage started to collapse, following Annie giving birth to their first child, James. And this was when Annie also found out that Thomas was being unfaithful. Annie nervously said in an article in the Daily Record on Wednesday the 26th of October 1977, having just recovered from a nervous breakdown, that Thomas didn't smoke and only drank the occasional lager, but he enjoyed going to the movies, and that if he had the money he would go there every night, and that his favourite star was Doris Day. Annie said that Thomas was always well-groomed, clean-cut and dressed neatly, whether going to work or out for the evening, taking hours in the bathroom, sprucing himself up. And one of Thomas's ex-bosses at a lorry driving company also said that not only was Thomas one of the best workers he had ever employed, but that he also was clean, kept his lorry cab tidy, was always punctual, and he never moaned about having to start work early or work late. On the occasions, though, when Thomas didn't have money to go on a night out, Annie said that he would stay in and laze around in the living room, reading his favourite tenpence war comics, or The Dandy and the Beano. He also apparently enjoyed watching the TV until it closed down for the night before going to bed. Little did Annie know at the time, but Thomas also enjoyed many more unsavoury pastimes when out of the house. Annie then went on to describe, in the same newspaper article, the other side to Thomas that she and her children faced when he was at home, saying that he was very possessive and that there was no apparent reason for the violence she suffered at the hands of Thomas. Although Annie did reflect in this newspaper article that she believed Thomas had beaten her because he was jealous of their baby son James, going on to say that he probably felt I was not paying enough attention to him. She recalled in the newspaper article one particularly brutal incident where Thomas had repeatedly kicked her under the sink before throwing her into a small broom cupboard and nailing the door shut with 6-inch nails. She said it had been an hour before he had let her out. Annie spent 6 weeks in hospital following this particularly brutal attack from Thomas, with the doctors at the time thinking that she may have lost her sight as the beating she had been given was so severe. While suffering terrible abuse from Thomas, she also began to hear rumours that he was being unfaithful, which was confirmed when a woman he had been seen on a night out with in Glasgow turned up at his home to see him, unaware that he was married. Upon finding this out, though, she apparently packed him in. But the extramarital affairs didn't end there, and at Christmas time in 1957, Thomas turned up at home with a pullover that had been a Christmas present from the girl he was seeing at that time, along with a card that read, "Love from Margaret." Upon realising who this pullover was from, Annie said she threw it and the card onto the fire, for which she was severely beaten. By this time, Thomas and Annie had had 3 further children, 2 further sons and a daughter, with Annie saying that even her children were not safe from Thomas and his violence, with Thomas apparently half killing one of his sons by slashing him across his throat. And as his children grew up and married, Thomas even assaulted his 2 young daughter-in-laws. The only person safe from Thomas appeared to be his daughter, Patricia, who was called the love of his life, and who he loved to buy presents for weekly. By 1961, when Thomas was 27 years old, and after 13 years of not having any involvement with the police, Thomas appeared at Glasgow Sheriff Court on a charge of theft again, being fined £8. The following year, he was at Dumbarton Sheriff Court, charged with housebreaking, and this time he was jailed for 60 days. And the following year, 1963, he was back at Glasgow Sheriff Court again. This time he was jailed for 3 months for failing to maintain his children. While Thomas was in prison serving these 3 months, Annie had another visitor, another young girl knocking at her door, professing her love for Thomas, and asking Annie to divorce Thomas so she could be with him, which Annie readily agreed to, by this time desperate for a way out of her abusive relationship and life with Thomas. Sadly, this plan fell through, and when Thomas's 3-month sentence was completed, Annie felt she had no choice but to take him back, saying that she was so frightened. She went on to say in the article that following Thomas coming back home, we slept in separate beds, and I only saw him at the weekends, as Thomas had secured himself a job as a long-distance lorry driver upon his release. and it was this job that afforded Thomas much more freedom to carry out his most heinous crimes thus far, which finally came to a head in October 1977. While Annie was by now well aware of the violent and sexually obsessed man she had married, who she now only had to suffer on the weekends, she wouldn't find out just how depraved this man could be until much later. The first she realised that there might be more to Thomas than just a violent, cheating husband was when he was charged with raping a 19-year-old girl in England, with the rape occurring in January 1967, exactly a month before Pat McAdam went missing. At the time of his arrest, though, he told Annie, who he was still cohabiting with, if only on weekends, that this 19-year-old girl was a prostitute, and that she had accused him of rape because he refused to pay her for sex. Annie said in the newspaper article that, despite knowing what Thomas was like, she believed his story and stood by him, going on to say that, "I felt I might have been partly to blame because I was undersexed, and that I knew that he fancied other girls." Thomas received an 18-month prison sentence for this charge, but upon being released he was back at their End Terrace home with Annie, where he continued to work as a long-distance lorry driver. Now, do you remember back in episode 1 when I was talking about the investigation into Pat McAdam's disappearance, when I said that Pat's mum and dad were travelling all over the country speaking to and interviewing as many people as they could to try and find out what happened to Pat, and speaking with one person in particular that surprised me the most? Well, Pat's mum and dad made the trip to Thomas and Annie's house during this time and spoke with Annie, begging her to speak to Thomas, who was by then serving an 18-month prison sentence for rape, and try and find out if he knew what had become of Pat, or if he was involved in any way with Pat's disappearance. Annie said that she did try, but that Thomas refused to speak with her. But she did say that she was convinced he was hiding something and believed in her heart that Thomas had indeed been involved in some way with Pat McAdam's disappearance. Anyway, less than a year after being released from his 18-month prison sentence, Thomas was back in court again, this time charged with raping a 15-year-old schoolgirl in his lorry cab in Lanarkshire, where he apparently told the court that picking up girls was easy, that he often picked up girl hitchhikers all over the country, and that he always got his own way. In February 1970, he was found guilty of this charge and sentenced to 8 years in prison. It was at this point that Annie could no longer stand by Thomas, now having her doubts about his involvement with Pat McAdam's disappearance as well, and so she started divorce proceedings. She said in the article that, "When I told him in prison I was divorcing him, he blew up. He said, 'I will kill you,' in such a way that I believed him." Thomas and Annie were finally divorced in 1973, but that wouldn't be the end of the trauma for Annie and her children, as just 2 short years later in June 1975, after serving just over 5 years of his 8-year prison sentence, Thomas was again a free man. And while he didn't move back into the family home this time, renting a flat instead near St George's Cross in Glasgow, he still would regularly return to the home to see his children, especially his then 16-year-old daughter Patricia, who he loved to lavish gifts on. And it would be this very act that put the final nail in Thomas Ross Young's coffin. At the time of Thomas being released from prison in 1975, his photo and criminal history was circulated to senior detectives in Scotland with a warning to "watch this man." But despite this, his depraved acts on women and lust for sex and violence would continue for another 2 years before he was finally off the streets for good, when he received 2 life sentences for the murder of 37-year-old Frances Barker, 2 attempted murders and 3 rapes, with the presiding trial judge imposing a 30-year minimum term. It was at this 7-day trial that the extent of Thomas's depravity was revealed. For so many years, Thomas Young's cab had become a vice centre, where prostitutes were taken to a favourite haunt of his, being a multi-storey car park on Waterloo Street in Glasgow, where he would expect the women to give in to his sadistic demands. And if they did not, he would beat and rape them until they had no choice but to give in to his demands, before being thrown from his cab, battered and bleeding, once he had finished with them. If there were no prostitutes willing or available for Thomas's cravings and demands, he went in search of other victims, on occasions hiring a car and disguising it as a taxi to attract female fares, and where, on one occasion, he picked up a pensioner in his taxi and robbed and assaulted her, and another time he tried to force a young woman into his taxi while she waited on a quiet road for a bus one night. When working as a long-distance lorry driver, Thomas easily found victims up and down the UK by luring female hitchhikers into his cab with his always plausible silver-tongued lies about himself and his home life, appearing initially as a gentle, kind, sad man whose wife had died, leaving him heartbroken, turning into a beast once he had them in his cab, but always getting his own way, one way or another. Okay, so in October 1977, the Francis Barker murder trial began. I'm not going to go into the life and murder of Francis Barker, as I covered this in part 1 of our linked or not linked episodes, so you can go and refresh your memory there. But briefly, Francis disappeared in June 1977, and her partially naked, bound and badly decomposed and mummified body was found 16 days later in a grave of leaves and branches. While her cause of death was almost impossible to determine for sure due to the decomposition, the post-mortem pointed to her having been murdered by strangulation, suffocation or both, due to the tiny bone above the Adam's apple having been dislocated. While forensic officers painstakingly collected evidence from the scene, police officers began a murder investigation, quickly coming to the conclusion that Francis had been picked up and murdered by a curb crawler. And so they visited the red light district in Glasgow to speak to the sex workers, hoping that they could point them to a likely candidate for Francis's assault and murder. Striking gold when a sex worker could not only think of a very likely and violent man, but had also taken down the registration number of this man's lorry, a man who very regularly visited the red light district. And it was none other than Thomas Ross Young, the same man who police in Dumfries had questioned around the disappearance of Pat McAdam. Thomas Young was quickly found and his lorry cab was forensically tested. 2 dyed hairs with blood on them were found in the cab and were determined to have belonged to Francis Barker, along with a single hawthorn leaf, which could have come from a branch that had been used to conceal Francis's body after she had been murdered. Not conclusive proof that Thomas had murdered Francis, but a case was definitely building against him, and there definitely was enough evidence for an arrest warrant to be issued, a month after Francis Barker had first gone missing. Now police just had to find Thomas, as he had gone AWOL. Presumably having realised that the net was closing in on him, Thomas had gone into hiding, choosing to go to his ex-wife Annie's now flat, presumably while she was out or away from her home, and cut a hole in the floorboards large enough for him to go inside and hide. However, not being able to locate Thomas, police kept a watch on any potential places he may go, and after a few days in this hideout, Thomas, perhaps thinking the coast was now clear, came out of his hideout and the flat, and he was promptly arrested. It would be what was found in this makeshift hideout and in his ex-wife's flat that served to finally bring an end to Thomas Young's reign of terror. Upon speaking to Francis Barker's friends and family, police established that on the night she went missing, she was wearing a distinctive silver bangle and that she always carried with her a makeup case which contained a recently gifted green powder Clinique compact. Found under the floorboards in Thomas's hiding place, police found a green powder Clinique compact. They also found, though, 4 small buttons, 3 white and 1 blue, which did not belong to Francis Barker. And found in amongst Thomas's daughter Patricia's jewellery was Francis's distinctive silver bangle, which had been gifted to Patricia from her dad, Thomas. Upon Thomas being arrested on the 12th of July 1977 and questioned about the green Clinique compact and the bangle, he said that he had bought the bangle from a pawnbroker and the green compact from a chemist near his home in Glasgow. However, upon police investigating Thomas's claims, they were unable to find the pawnbroker who had apparently sold the distinctive silver bangle to him, and that the green compact Francis had been given to her by a beauty consultant friend of hers, and that this particular green Clinique compact had never actually been on sale in Glasgow, like Thomas had suggested, but had been one of only 150 given to staff and special customers in a particular store in Sauchiehall Street in Glasgow. This, along with 2 of Francis's blood-stained hairs and a leaf that likely came from Francis's makeshift grave after her murder being found in Thomas's cab, led to Thomas being charged with Francis's murder and remanded in custody until his trial. Now, in July 1977, at the time Thomas was arrested and charged with Francis's murder, while police did not disclose his name to newspapers or that he was being charged with Francis's murder, what they did disclose to newspapers, including the Daily Record on the 13th of July 1977, was that a man who had been detained in connection with other matters had details of his description, background and alleged crime circulated to police throughout Britain, as other forces who were investigating murders and rapes of several hitchhikers over a period of several years may have been interested in this information. With it being confirmed that police officers from Inverness were interested in interviewing this man in regards to the disappearance of Rennie and Andrew McRae, a case we covered in February 2023. Dumfries police were also interested in speaking to this man regarding Pat McAdam's disappearance, and Glasgow police were even interested in looking at the Bible John murders again to see if this man could have been involved. This man was also to be quizzed by detectives from England in connection with 23 unsolved murders, as well as other police forces who were still investigating a number of unsolved murders and sex attacks where a vehicle was used. It was reported, though, in an article 2 days later that this man had virtually been cleared of having any involvement in the Rennie and Andrew McRae case, but he was still being questioned around the other cases. It wouldn't be until closer to the start of the trial, which was on the 19th of October, that Thomas Young was finally named as the man who had been charged with not only murdering 37-year-old Frances Barker by strangling her and pushing a pair of pants into her mouth, but also, according to an article in the Daily Record on the 26th of October 1977, of raping and attempting to murder a prostitute at the same place that Frances's body was found, of raping another prostitute at knife point in a multi-storey car park, of raping a 16-year-old girl in his home and committing indecent sexual acts against her, of attacking, robbing and raping a 65-year-old pensioner, of attacking and attempting to murder a young woman in a bus shelter, of attacking his ex-wife Annie by punching her on the head and body and threatening her with further violence, of assaulting and attempting to commit an indecent sexual act against a 46-year-old prostitute near Charing Cross, of raping another woman and assaulting and pushing a burning cigarette against the face of another prostitute in a multi-storey car park, all of which Thomas Young pleaded not guilty to. At the trial, Thomas's long history of depravity against women came out, of having for 30 years battered, raped and robbed so many women, according to Thomas himself, having had sex with more than 200 girls in the cab of his lorry, leaving his final victim, Frances Barker, bound, gagged and half-naked in a grave. Throughout the 7-day trial, where woman after woman took to the stand to give evidence about the horrendous abuse they had suffered, their abuser, Thomas Young, just sat in the dock, staring straight ahead, with his arms folded, refusing to make eye contact with his victims, including his ex-wife Annie, who gave evidence against him for 30 minutes, saying later that, "I was terrified all the time I was giving evidence, terrified he would jump out and attack me. I had nothing but hate for him. More than that, a deep nausea." The only person Thomas Young tried to make eye contact with while they were on the stand giving evidence was his beloved daughter Patricia, who later said that she just couldn't bring herself to look at him as she gave evidence for 20 minutes, only that she merely glanced at him as she initially came into the court, saying that, "I don't want to know him. He's brought nothing but heartache to me and the family." None of Thomas's family, including the daughter he doted on, visited him in prison, despite him repeatedly sending passes to his daughter. At the end of the trial at the High Court in Glasgow, it took the jury 57 minutes to make the decisions on his charges, finding him guilty of murder, 2 attempted murders, and 3 rapes. But he was found not guilty of raping the 65-year-old pensioner, of assaulting and attempting to commit an indecent sexual act against a 46-year-old prostitute near Charing Cross, or of raping another woman. Before handing out 2 life sentences with a minimum term of 30 years, the presiding judge, Lord MacDonald, said to Thomas, "You are a dangerous man, and the public must be protected from you." Thomas was then taken to begin his sentences. After the trial, Thomas's ex-wife, Annie, said that he is a man without conscience. He is a beast and deserves no mercy. But she was still haunted by and lived in mental agony by the nagging thought that I drove him to other women because I was undersexed. Upon Thomas being found guilty, senior detectives again travelled from Dumfries to Glasgow to question him about the disappearance of Pat McAdam, hoping that as he would not ever be a free man again, that he might be willing to admit his involvement in Pat's disappearance. Police still believing that to be the case, despite having no evidence or proof. But no, Thomas had nothing to say to police officers about Pat McAdam's disappearance. Pat's case, though, was at that time finally changed to presumed murdered instead of just missing. But what about the other unsolved murders and rape cases across the UK? And what about the 4 buttons found along with Francis Barker's green compact in Thomas's hideout? Well, police forces up and down the country reopened cases on many missing and murdered women and women who had been raped after Thomas's conviction, and samples of his blood were sent to them for comparison. And police forces in the UK were also alerted to these 4 buttons to see if these buttons matched with any of their unsolved cases. Sadly, it would appear that either there wasn't enough evidence or there just were no matches with Thomas's blood samples against any other unsolved cases, as no further charges were ever brought against Thomas. And it was the same story with the buttons. No matches were found and Thomas was cleared. So who did the 4 buttons belong to? 3 white and 1 blue. Other victims not yet known, or was there a completely innocent reason? Although, if innocent, why hide them in your own hiding place? This remains a mystery. After the conclusion of the trial, an article also appeared in the Daily Record on the 26th of October 1977 from a leading psychiatrist who had some interesting things to say regarding Thomas Young and his depraved behaviour. The psychiatrist said that it was obvious Thomas had a tremendously high abnormal sex drive, and that, when a man like that is in a sexual fury, it's just a case of wanting to gratify himself with any female. It doesn't matter where or with whom, how old, young, pretty or ugly the female is. He explained that Thomas appeared to be able to control his urges when he was working, with Thomas's boss saying he basically was one of his best ever employees, explaining that this was because when a person like Thomas is working hard, their mind is occupied and they don't have time to fantasize about girls. But when they're not working or perhaps a bit bored, then the impulse will come over them and they will just have to have a woman. Any woman would do. He went on to say that it was still unknown as to why a man like this should get so sexually inflamed and behave without reason. The only advice the psychiatrist could give to anyone concerned about such men's behaviours was this: one can only give a grim warning to women not to accept lifts from strange men, and that mothers really should warn their daughters about the danger, because a man like this with a personality disorder is very dangerous indeed. He did helpfully go on to say, though, that in Scandinavia, a rapist is often castrated, and if he agrees, his sentence is reduced, as such an operation takes away the sex drive. Thomas Young continued to claim he was innocent of Francis Barker's murder, that he had been set up, and he was even granted 2 appeal hearings. One where his minimum sentence of 30 years was reduced to 25 years, and another appeal which challenged the safety of his conviction of Francis Barker's murder. But this appeal failed. Thomas did, however, spend the rest of his time in prison protesting his innocence. And in the next episode, we'll hear how a retired detective said, following a cold case probe, that it wasn't Thomas Young who had killed Francis Barker, but another man, after this man was convicted in 2014 of the murder of 2 young girls in Edinburgh. Oh, what a tangled web. Okay, so that's not the end of Thomas's story, far from it. In November 2004, it was reported in the Aberdeen Press and Journal that following a police investigation called Operation Trucker, a 70-year-old man, who police were refusing to name, was arrested and charged with Pat McAdam's murder. and that a report would be sent to the Procurator Fiscal. Fantastic! Although it wouldn't be until September 2007 that this man, now named as Thomas Young, appeared in court charged with Pat McAdam's murder, where he made no plea. On the 8th of August 2014, it was announced in an ITV newspaper article that 79-year-old Thomas Ross Young had died in prison. But had he been tried and convicted of Pat McAdam's disappearance and murder before he died? Find out in our next episode. But from this episode, do you feel you know far more about Thomas Young and his life than you did about Pat McAdam and her life before it was cut short after listening to episode 1? I certainly do. Just before I go, I hope that everybody that went to CrimeCon in Manchester at the weekend had a fantastic time. I'm really disappointed that we weren't able to make it after all. It sounded fantastic. Hope to see you at CrimeCon in London next year. Join us for the final part of the Pat McAdam disappearance next week. Until then, I've been your host, Dawn.
Scottish Murders is a production of Clurin Ton.